This is Bob Wayland. I'm Vice President of the EPA Alumni Association, and I'm delighted that you've joined our Clean Water Act 50th anniversary celebration today. We've assembled a really impressive panel of people with decades of experience. Their positions and accomplishments are too numerous for us to cover in the 2 hours that we have this afternoon, but we've listed all those on several of the announcements, and it'll be available on our website when we post the recording of this session. We have two panels, and we've allocated more time to the first panel than the second because it has 5 participants and panel 2 has 3 participants. We'll have a 5-minute break at approximately 5 o'clock, so you can refresh your beverage or take care of any other biological imperatives. I want to thank those who submitted Clean Water Act stories to us. One of the things we ask you to do to commemorate the 50th anniversary. We also suggested it was a good time to reach out and recruit additional members, particularly those who worked in water programs or supported the Clean Water Act. So if you haven't done that, please do so. We will have people watching today who are not yet members of the association. It's easy to join, so I hope you'll be inspired after today's session to join if for any reason you've just been procrastinating. It's easy to sign up on the website. Earlier today, there was a session in Cleveland, which Luana and Ben attended, among many, many other dignitaries, where EPA recognized the importance of the Clean Water Act on the shores of the occasionally flammable Cuyahoga River. We will shortly turn to the current AA for Water, who was also at that session with Michael Reagan, the administrator, and other dignitaries. Radhika Fox will precede panel 1. Panel 1 will be moderated by Dave Ulrich, and it will begin right after the pre-recorded message from the AA for Water. Then following the break, Alexis Strauss, former DRA in Region 9 and longtime Water Division Director, will launch her panel. After 6 p.m., for those who wish to stay, we'll go into breakout rooms in which you can chat informally with some of your colleagues. So right now, let's go ahead and see the pre-recorded message from the current AA for Water.
Hello, everyone. I'm so honored to address such a dedicated group of EPA alumni, and I'm so sorry I can't be with you in person to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act. Today, I'm with Administrator Regan, members of Team EPA, and many of our partners from across the country on the banks of the Cuyahoga River, where so much of this work began. You know, just think about where we were as a country 50 years ago. There was so much pollution in our air, our land, our water, that rivers ran in colors, and water bodies like the Cuyahoga River caught on fire multiple times. But the American people came together. They said our waters mattered, and they pushed for Congress to pass one of the most monumental pieces of environmental legislation, the Clean Water Act. You know, we may take it for granted now, but think about the ambition of the Clean Water Act, the North Star of making our nation's waters fishable and swimmable, from on fire to fishable and swimmable. And for the past 50 years, the Clean Water Act has led to transformative change that so many of you spearheaded during your time at EPA. Whether it's the treatment standards for wastewater treatment plants, regulating discharges of point source pollution into our waters, or setting water quality criteria for lakes and streams, the Clean Water Act is protecting people's health and well-being each and every day. And for that, I want to personally thank you. Over the past couple of months, I've had the honor of visiting and spotlighting Clean Water Act success stories across the country, from the Chesapeake Bay to the Puget Sound, and it's been so incredibly exciting to see the work happening all across the country. And as we celebrate today, I want you to know that this EPA takes seriously our responsibility to carry on your good work and fully implement the Clean Water Act. We're crafting a durable definition of waters of the United States that prioritizes implementation and protecting our vital water resources. We're taking action to strengthen the authority of states, territories, and tribes through our 401 water quality certification rulemaking. And we're utilizing our effluent limitation guidelines rulemaking to reduce PFAS in our waters. We are working hard to strengthen the Clean Water Act regulatory framework while also investing historic resources provided to EPA through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. Thanks to President Biden's leadership and bipartisan congressional action, the Office of Water is investing $50 billion in water infrastructure dollars. Those investments, coupled with our regulatory work, are going to supercharge the next 50 years of clean water progress. You know, we have come so far as a country, but we still have so much to do to build upon the legacy you all have been so foundational to creating. As we think about the next 50 years of progress, let our North Star be fishable and swimmable for all. Clean water for all. In another 50 years, let us be a nation where all of our children, all of our grandchildren have clean, safe water, no matter the color of their skin, their zip code, or income. Thank you for all that you do on behalf of people and our nation's waters, and happy anniversary to the Clean Water Act.
It is. Once I take my mute off, it is encouraging to see that the leadership of the agency in the water program is going to keep things going for at least another 50 years. As Bob mentioned, we have an excellent set of panelists, both in the first and the second panel, and we're going to plunge right into those. I will be asking some questions of individual panelists, but I want to make sure that other panelists, if they feel compelled to make a comment, to raise your hand or let me know some way that you would like to add to the answer that was given. Also, if you have questions, please put them in the chat box and we will do our best to get to those during the course of the program. So with no further ado, I want to turn it over to Ben Grumbles, who is uniquely qualified to talk about an exceedingly important part of Clean Water Act implementation, and that is the federal-state working relationship. Ben has had leadership roles in Maryland, Arizona, ECOS for all of the states, and EPA as well. And Ben has made some special efforts to be with us today. So Ben, thank you for being here. And as I said, you have the unique perspective of seeing the Clean Water Act from a number of different job areas, and particularly the federal-state relationship. And I'm especially interested to know your thoughts about what types of impediments there are to making that an effective relationship, and what is the best way to overcome those impediments?
Hey, thanks, Dave. And I apologize for the challenges of coming to you live from the Cleveland airport. But I just came from the awesome celebration for the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act. And I would just say the cooperative federalism phrase was really put into action in '72 and is going to be continuously as important as ever today. And getting together to celebrate the bipartisan unity among the states and the nation and the federal officials on the Clean Water Act is, I think, the most important thing we can be doing right now as we redouble our efforts to meet the new challenges. So the '72 Act, the whole approach of taking an incredibly bold step for national standards and neighborhood solutions crafted through state and local efforts, but with federal standards and enforcement that apply to all waters that met the Clean Water Act test, not just to interstate or Rivers and Harbors Act water. So that's hugely important. And to answer your question, Dave, the key is for the federal government to respect the role and leadership responsibilities of the states, as Luana Wiltshire reminded folks today, to provide support and respect and technical training, as well as enforcement. And that's the whole beauty of the Clean Water Act structure: regulatory accountability, flexibility, and also incredibly important infrastructure investments.
Very good, Ben. Thanks very much. From your direct experience in Maryland and Arizona, and then looking at things nationally from the ECOS and headquarters perspective, it's obvious that there are varying degrees of capacity across the country, and different policies, different areas of emphasis. And of course, that's true across the 10 regions of EPA as well. The concept of a level playing field is always an important thing. How did you deal with this issue of the variability across the country, whether it's state by state or in terms of the different regions?
Well, you're right that the level playing field, particularly when you have the upstream versus downstream conundrum and challenges, is very important. Having in place national standards and expectations and increased investment in capacity building has been important. States welcome the need for tools and training. They also need to have greater flexibility to meet those standards. That's a very important part. But as everyone knows, the national journey for fishable and swimmable, respected and protected waters has not been smooth sailing. And so now states and ECOS, all 50 of the states, are very much focused on implementation and enforcement, and rising to the new challenges through science and opportunities, through increased monitoring and modeling, precision point identification of the where you can get the most bang for your buck, using new tools from drones to other types of remote sensing abilities. But I think the states are really excited about the once in a generation investment opportunities through the bipartisan infrastructure law, and working together and letting EPA know when there's variation among the regions that doesn't make sense, to try to figure out why. Is that customization, or is it just the need for EPA to spend more time? And but the states recognize that every region is different, but we are the beauty of the Clean Water Act as a national program for chemical, physical, biological integrity of all of the nation's waters that are regulated by the Act, is so noble and so important, and we need to just keep working together, feds and states and tribes.
So Ben, you've been very concise and direct in your replies and informative for us, so that qualifies you for another question. It's not a trick question, but it occurs to me that there's a lot of attention on water quantity these days, in addition to water quality, but particularly with the situation in the Southwest, in the water shortages. And I guess we've got a little different picture in the Midwest, where we've got a lot of water and we're not too excited about sending it around the country. But I'm just wondering how you see this water quantity issue playing out in the context of the traditional water quality work that's part of the Clean Water Act.
So I'm wearing the EPA US WaterSense tie to signal the importance of not only water efficiency and conservation, because every drop counts, but also consistent with the Clean Water Act's focus on zero discharge, that water efficiency is a very important way to integrate holistic one water principles into the federal and state strategies for water management. And now more than ever, one of the most important climate resiliency tools is using the law and the programs from the National Water Resource Action, Reuse Action Plan, the Water Reuse Action Plan, to strategies for energy, water nexus, and greater efficiency to expand supplies in ways without necessary. So it's demand management and integrating for one water. I think that is going to be one of the most important opportunities for water managers and climate adaptation and resiliency officers throughout the country, is to embrace efficiency, conservation, and reuse. And that, of course, is integrally connected to water quality. So I think we have the basic tools. We need to just keep working to implement the National Water Reuse Action Plan and ways to make sure every American observes that, you know, every drop counts. And that's going to be particularly important in very scary situations with increasing heat and drought and wildfires.
Very good, Ben. One last question. Giving you an opportunity to give advice to the current AA and all of the future water warriors that we have out here. What advice would you give to those who are going to be involved in implementation of the Clean Water Act in the coming 50 years, particularly related to federal state cooperative partnership, or even more broadly? What advice would you give?
The first bit is to take every bit of advice with a grain of salt, particularly from former AAs. But honestly, the advice would be, and I'm not just sucking up to the crowd, but it is to listen to the policy managers and experts who surround you on scientific and technical and legal advice. Listen to them. But also explore innovative approaches. And I feel like we really need to find innovative approaches. You know, how does Title VI of the Civil Rights Act fit into the Federal Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act? And how do we integrate holistic approaches without having to get an act of Congress to do so? I think that the bit of advice is to leave some regulatory space for innovation and flexibility, and particularly at the state level, with the state stepping up and really taking charge and running so many of the programs under the water laws, including the Clean Water Act. You know, try to give them some flexibility and let them know that there will be accountability as well. That would be the salty advice.
Well, we will take both of your advices, if you will, not to follow your advice, but the good ideas in your advice. Ben, thanks again very much for your adjusting your schedule to be with us. We deeply appreciate it and your perspectives. Moving on to someone who I have known and worked with and been a friend now for 50 years, I guess it is, just about. Dale Bryson, who was the water director in Region 5, and for many, many years, and deputy before that. Dale taught me not quite everything I know, but a lot of what I know. And when I grow up, I want to be like Dale. So Dale, you were one of the people who were involved even before the Clean Water Act was passed. And I'd like to hear a little bit of your perspective on the things that you were involved in that led up to the passage of the Clean Water Act, and then, if you will, flowed on after the passage. So tell us a little bit about the pre-1972 time period.
Thanks, Dave. When I look back at the decade of the 1960s, I'm absolutely astounded at what was accomplished during that decade with a very, very, very weak federal law at the start of the decade. And then that changed as the year went on. When I started my career with the predecessor of EPA, it was in the San Francisco Regional Office. We were in a tiny, tiny, tiny division of the Public Health Service within DHEW. In that San Francisco Regional Office, there were about 20 people, the entire staff. the state, excuse me, the federal law, every federal law and every amendment since it was first created has stressed the states having the primary right and responsibility. That has been a real challenge at some times, but it has really worked in spite of all the problems to make it work. As Ben said earlier and Bob said, during the 60s, public interest in water pollution control was gaining tremendously. Congress responded with passing 4 different amendments to the act, all of which increased the federal responsibility with the states in the lead. The 65 amendments, I think, were very instrumental in those changes, requiring the states to adopt water quality standards within 1 year. And if they didn't, we had to do that. That was a major change because that could put us in the lead, which was a bit controversial. The 65 Act also increased the enforcement responsibilities, made enforcement a little bit easier. But driving that whole process in the 60s was, again, the states in the lead. So a lot of our time, rightfully so, was spent working with the states, trying to foster a better relationship with them to make things work better. We had some real challenges during that time period. Congress, as I said, passed 4 amendments. They moved us from this tiny public health service division over to a new agency, Federal Water Pollution Control Administration. And then a year later, moved us to the Department of Interior. Now, I spent my entire career in the region, San Francisco and then Chicago. We had real challenges with those switches. I just cannot imagine what headquarters went through with those switches between agencies. The point being that during that time in the 60s, most of our effort, Dave, was spent trying to figure out how to implement the laws in an effective fashion. Major challenges in doing so, but as I said earlier, when I look back, the success we had, I thought, was outstanding.
Well, very good, Dale. There was a pretty important case in the upper Midwest early on that I think helped. It wasn't quite as dramatic as the Cuyahoga River and fire and Lake Erie being declared dead, but Reserve Mining was a facility up on the north shore of Lake Superior and Silver Bay, where I can't remember, 65,000 tons of tailings a day were going into Lake Superior, and then some asbestiform fibers found their way down to the Duluth water supply. I understand you were involved in that case. Can you tell us just a little bit about it?
That case was extremely interesting, extremely long, and extremely difficult. But the final outcome really strengthened EPA's program, as far as I'm concerned. You kind of summarize the key points. Reserve was discharging 67,000 tons a day of tailings. They had a permit from the Corps of Engineers and from the state of Minnesota to do so. And everybody assumed when they were granted that permit that this density current would carry everything to the bottom of Lake Superior. But in the 60s, mid-60s, we started to experience green water throughout Lake Superior. We would sample it and we couldn't really find anything because it was so minute, but we knew it was a problem. The 3 governors around Lake Superior wanted an enforcement conference to look into it, which we did, and the conferees concluded that Reserve had to go to an on-land disposal and therefore cease their discharge to the lake. Minnesota, the company said no. Minnesota sued them, and then EPA sued them in 1972. The case went through many iterations at the district court level and the Court of Appeals level. The Court of Appeals even removed one of the judges because they said he was biased against the company. The point being that the case finally settled in 1982. Yeah. So 10 years after we filed it, which makes it one of the longest cases we've ever had. The key issue in the whole thing was the uncertainty as to whether reserves discharge of this asbestos-like material was endangering the public health and the environment. The Court of Appeals, the Court of Appeals judge ruled that potential but unproven risk did exist from those tailings, and that was something that EPA could factor into any rulemaking. So that kind of set a precedent as a background to help us on any future rulemaking, that we didn't have to have definitive proof, but uncertainty we could use and run with. So the reserve case, long and difficult. The state and us, EPA and the predecessor, spent hundreds of thousands of hours and dollars trying to get them to stop the discharge, which we eventually did.
Well, I always enjoy how Dale will get talking about these legal proceedings. And as a lawyer in Region 5, we were not always nearest and dearest in heart to Dale, but he learned how to live with us. So thanks for taking us through that. Dale, another predecessor and something that led up to the Clean Water Act was the old 1899 Refuse Act, and that got geared up shortly before 1972 with the old Refuse Act permit program. I remember hearing it called the RAP program. This was before rap music really got very popular. But can you tell us just a little bit about that RAP permit program, and particularly how that led into the NPDES permit program?
Good question, Dave. The 1899 Rivers and Harbors Act obviously has been hanging around a long time. It was not passed as the pollution control bill. It was passed to control the filling of rivers with sediments. The Supreme Court in 1966 had a case in front of them, and they made a ruling that defined refuse as not, and let me quote that, as all foreign substances and pollutants. By adding that two words, and pollutants, they kind of changed the landscape big time. That law also had an interesting provision called a bounty hunters provision, that if you made a referral to the Corps of Engineers, you were entitled to half of any fines that were collected. So once industry saw that, that made them liable, some 40,000 discharges liable for criminal prosecution. Within a couple of years, 500 cases, over 500 cases were filed with the Corps, in federal and state courts under that law against industry. So industry, of course, got very concerned. They started making applications to the Corps for permits. Some 23,000 applications were submitted. And at that point, the Corps turned to us and says, what do we do? And we said, we have no idea. We've never run a permit program. We've never had a permit program. So we started to try to make it work. The President Nixon, I'm sure with help from others, created that RAP program by executive order in 1970, and said that, and said in his statement that this was a pollution control law, and it was designed to protect the rivers and to protect water quality standards. Fortunately, an Ohio District Court overruled that RAP program a year later, but there we were in the late 60s with 23,000 applications. And what do? The 72 amendments came along and created the permit program, the NPDES permit program, and we started to figure out how to make that work. We had no staff. We had no experience in a permit program. We didn't know how to write permits. We had to establish, going back to Ben's comments, some really good relationships with all 50 states to deal with each and every permit, so that we incorporated in that permit what the state wanted as well. And we ended up then meeting the requirement of the law to get those permits issued by a date certain, which we did meet. You know, when I look back at that, the accomplishments of that permit program, I think were stupendous, with a lot of work by the states and a lot of work by us.
Dale, thanks very much. In the spirit of making sure all of the other speakers have plenty of time, I'm going to move on to Jim Hanlon at this point, who has had regional and headquarters experience in the construction grants and state revolving fund programs. Jim, can you tell us a little bit about the situation with the very serious problems at wastewater treatment plants, and particularly financial capacity was something that had to be dealt with. Can you tell us a little bit about how EPA and the states ramped up their capacity to deal with this and getting the funds that were necessary out to the municipalities so they could proceed with the necessary construction?
Okay, Dave, and thank you. Am I off mute? Am I okay?
Yep.
Unlike Dale, who was on board for years and years prior to 1972, my federal career preceded October 18th by 17 workdays. So I was a new guy, but recognizing that, the congressional intent obviously was to invest in municipal wastewater treatment. The dollars that were included in the 72 Act were precedential at the time, and probably to this time. Recognize that in the 1972 Act, $18 billion were both authorized and appropriated. It was contract authority. The money was on the table, available, except shortly after President Nixon impounded effectively $3 billion a year for fiscals 73, 4, and 5. That case went to the Supreme Court, and that's why we now have a effectively an anti-impoundment act that precludes presidents from impounding dollars. That all stemmed from the 72 Clean Water Act. There existed, so basically the Congress said, we're going to invest in municipal wastewater treatment. That was the objective. Here's the money. The program wasn't started from a blank sheet of paper. As Dale said, the Federal Water Pollution Control Act existed prior to 72. There was a grant program. In 1971, it was funded at $1.25 billion. So the states, along with the regional offices, had a system, somewhat of a framework to build on. However, the 72 Act significantly changed that, not only in terms of total dollars. First of all, the funding levels went from 50% to 75% federal grants. Pretty good deal. Again, recognizing that they wanted to provide an incentive for municipalities to move forward. Basically, there was a preparation. The Clean Water Act was under discussion on the Hill for 18 or more months prior to October of 72. So basically, there was anticipation of the act coming, and there were, the municipal construction program, the states, the development of plans and specifications was all proceeding somewhat in anticipation of the increased funding levels coming along. But with that, and also, again, like the permit program, like the water quality standards program, the construction grant program from its outset had a structure where the states and the agency were partners in implementation. States had to identify which projects were funded. So states created a priority list. They created a priority system. They had to certify projects that were ready to go. But also that all took a huge amount of cooperation between the states and the regions, because with the new Clean Water Act, it wasn't only a give us a final design and we'll fund it. The new program included something called Step 1 grants that were for planning. So basically, you had to do a facilities plan that looked at what capacity did you need? Was it consistent with an area-wide plan? Those came out of the Clean Water Act, the whole 208 program. How big should it be? What areas were you going to serve? And then once that was a grant that was funded, the plan was completed, submitted, approved, then you got a Step 2 grant for design, preparation of federal plans and final construction plans and specifications that could go out to the market for bid. Again, those were reviewed for federal requirements. Many of the states had engineering design requirements where they looked at, tank sizes, pump sizes. We did not do that. The agency didn't, but many of the states had those requirements. And then once those were approved, the project was ready for a construction grant that paid for the construction, again at 75%. Many of the states had additional or cooperating state grants. So many of the programs, especially my experience at the time was in Region 5, basically the grants were a total of 85%. So
Jim, what types of facilities was this funding, both federal and state, used for? What were the municipalities building to deal with their water pollution problems?
In the large cities, it was primarily treatment plants. Remember, in 1972, 29% of the US population was served by secondary treatment, 29%. New York City, Boston, Miami, Atlanta did not have secondary treatment.
Wow.
By 2012, 94% of the US population was served by secondary treatment. So early, heavy focus on wastewater treatment plants, secondary treatment, primarily in the Great Lakes. Dave, as you know, there was 1972 Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement that required phosphorus removal in the Great Lakes back in 72. So those plants had phosphorus removal, but there wasn't much else in terms of advanced treatment at the time. Also in the large cities, basically the large conduits, the intercepting sewers, if you will, 8, 10, 20 feet in diameter to get the flow to the treatment plants. Those were being built. In the small towns, though, very different. Much of rural America, the soils were not suitable for on-site systems, but they had septic tanks, or they had nothing. They had straight pipes. And so in rural America, certainly in Region 5, where I cut my teeth, many projects were built that installed collection sewers along with a wastewater treatment plant in small towns. And there was a debate over, okay, do we want to be, encouraging sprawl? Should we be, sewering for future development? So we went through this process of deciding the houses had to be there before you could fund a collection sewer. And we did street by street analysis. And then if the municipality wanted to pay the rest, that was fine. They had to come to us with their local financing plan, their bond issues. We looked at all that to make sure, basically, when that construction grant was made, the funds were going to be there to ensure it was constructed and then maintained. There were something called user charge systems, where they had to demonstrate how they were going to generate the revenue for the operation, maintenance, and replacement of those capital assets.
Jim, we're running a little short of time. Could you real quickly tell us about how you transitioned from the construction grant program to the state revolving fund? Real quickly.
Okay. 81, the program went from 75% grants to 55% grants. The 87 amendments phased out the construction grant program and converted it to the SRF, or State Revolving Loan Program, where EPA would give a grant to the states to basically capitalize a loan fund. And the design was that for 5 or 6 years, the EPA was going to make these grants, and then the state grants, the states were on their own. The SRFs would be self-perpetuating. They would collect the repayments of the original loans, loan it back out. That all worked just fine. And as was mentioned by the assistant administrator earlier, we're still the agency's still making grants to states for the SRF program. Total between the construction grant program and the SRF program, EPA has funded in excess of $200 billion of wastewater infrastructure over these last 50 years. And that just continues to expand. There's a new program called WIFIA in addition to the SRF. There's now a drinking water SRF that is continuing to fund the needed water infrastructure. Real quick, none of this would have happened without giants in the regional offices. My hero was a guy named Todd Kayer, who taught me everything I know. But there were Stu Peterson in Region 1, Bill Muszynski in Region 2. I'm sure all of you in your regions know who that person was. They, together with their state counterparts, is the reason this program was a success.
Well, very good, Jim. Thanks also for mentioning Todd. He was a real figure in Region 5 and big Green Bay Packer fan, among other things. But yeah, it takes people all over to make these things happen. Another critically important part of what EPA does is its trust responsibility to the Native American tribes across the country. We're very, very fortunate to have Ken Norton of the National Tribal Water Council with us today to tell us a little bit about the role of tribes in implementing the Clean Water Act. And in particular, Ken, if you've got a couple of examples of what you think are particularly successful implementation stories.
Thank you, David. I'd like to share two cornerstone examples of EPA's effective implementation of its trust responsibility to Native American tribes, starting with the 1984 adoption of EPA's Indian policy. This policy set the framework in how the agency was to engage with tribes on a government-to-government relationship. It guided the agency in how it would administer its environmental programs and regulations in Indian country. It recognized that the tenets of those programs must include the tribal trust doctrine and the concept of tribal environmental determination when EPA takes actions that have implications in Indian country. The second example is EPA's or the congressional amendments to the Clean Water Act, allowing tribes to obtain treatment in a similar manner as the state to implement Clean Water Act programs and regulatory programs in Indian country. To this day, this statute remains the most prevalent form of protection of tribal waters in Indian country.
Very good, Ken. That's very perceptive. I know that, at least in my experience in Region 5, I think we had 37 tribes concentrated in Minnesota, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And there were some, I don't know, I'll call it difficult times. It related more to fishing rights than necessarily water quality, but both of those did become involved. So I'm a little curious as to how you see that state and tribal relationship, I guess, particularly in the context of the trust responsibility that the federal government has. Tell us a little bit about that state tribal interaction.
Okay, but first, I'd like to, as Ben referenced, the cooperative federalism model that tribal environmental programs operate under allow tribes co-equal opportunities to administer EPA programs and regulatory actions in Indian country. And states began to accept that tribal regulatory presence within their jurisdictional waters. And it's in the arena of Clean Water Act permitting that tribes and states can work together when mutual goals to address transboundary pollution crosses from one jurisdiction into the other. But EPA has a very important role to play in that negotiations and developing that recognition between the states and tribes.
Ken, the Clean Water Act has a lot of interesting provisions, and one of them relates to, I guess the acronym is TAS. And
Mhm.
a lot of people said treatment as a state, but the tribes in Region 5 said, no, it's treatment as a sovereign, even
Yes.
though that might not have been the official language of the Clean Water Act. Did you have any experience with those situations where tribes implemented their own adopted and implemented their own water quality standards?
Yes, probably one of the paramount areas where a tribe had enforced its tribal value judgments in the implementation of its water quality standards was the Isleta Pueblo enforcement of its water quality standards in recognizing its cultural values and uses. The Isleta standards were more stringent than the federal minimums and the upstream state's jurisdiction. And when the court recognized that because there was a challenge by an upstream municipality under a Clean Water Act permit, the court recognized the Isleta's authority to administer Clean Water Act Section 510, and so did EPA concur that tribes have the authority, as states do, to implement more stringent standards than the neighboring jurisdictions that uphold their tribal sovereignty and tribal values and tribal needs.
Very good, Ken. The grants program that we just heard a little bit about, that was the focus on construction grants and wastewater treatment, but of course, there have been grants for program implementation and capacity building as well. Can you tell us a little bit about what role those grants played in Indian country across the US, where tribes were successful in getting grants, both for program implementation and for construction of facilities?
Sure. Excellent question. The tribal EPA grants in the Clean Water Act in the drinking water arena really makes changes in Indian country. We're starting to see more monies come in through under the Bills initiative, where we have third world conditions in Indian country, and those funds have made a significant difference and going to make a significant difference. The monitoring, either the water monitoring grants or the air monitoring grants, provides the tribe the baseline information it needs to establish either their tribally adopted water quality standards or moving forward with federally adopted water quality standards as the first line of defense in protecting their environmental components, be it air, water, or land. Very significant. But as Ben knows, there was many times that I went before him on the National Tribal Caucus, hat in hand, and saying, we need more money, Ben.
Well, and I'm sure Ben always got the checkbook out. That's why we all like Ben so much. Ken, thank you very, very much for being part of this and bringing the very, very important perspective of the Native American tribes in the United States. Now it is my real pleasure to turn the microphone and the screen over to one of my favorite people, Luana Wilshire, who brought an added element of class to the water program. in her years. She's had extensive experience in Kentucky environmental cabinet, in addition to being the assistant administrator for water for a number of years. And Luana, it's my understanding that in addition to implementation of the whole Clean Water Act, water wetlands was particularly near and dear to your heart. Could you tell us a little bit about why you focused on that, and a little bit about some of the things that you did to enhance the wetlands program?
Well, thanks a lot, Dave. And I've seen Ben earlier today, Jim and Dale and Dave. It's good to see you all. And Ken, hope we get a chance to meet sometime. And before I get to that, let me just say, Dave, I still have your Southern Comfort Punch recipe from back many years ago. And if you don't have it, you should try it. It's a wonderful festive holiday drink. So,
very good. That's why you look so young, I'm sure.
That's it. That's it. Thank you. So the wetlands program, I became pretty familiar with it when I was a special assistant to the general counsel before I was at EPA in '89. But, you know, the Office of Water encompasses so many things. I didn't come into the program planning to spend that much time. But if you'll recall, President Bush 41, George Herbert Walker, when he was running for election in 1988, said that the United States should have a goal of no net loss of wetlands. Well, add on to that Bill Riley's involvement in wetlands and the wetlands program. And then one day after a staff meeting, Bill said to me, Luana, you and the Corps, you know, the Office Water and the Corps of Engineers is always going like this. You can't seem to agree on anything. Why don't you get with the Corps of Engineers and see whether you all can work something out, work closely together. So I called Bob Page, Assistant Secretary of the Army, for one of my infamous 4:30 p.m. Meetings. So Jim's grinning because he probably knows where this is going, because the meetings that were at 4 or 4:30 were often accompanied by a little libation. So Bob was a Texan. So I talked to Dave Davis and said, Dave, we're going to have this meeting. What do I need to get from the Corps of Engineers? And he said, well, you know, we need to agree on sequencing and on mitigation. Bob came over, I pulled the Maker's Mark out of my desk drawer. I served Bob, the good Texan, some Maker's Mark. And before the meeting was over, Bob said, whatever you want, just send it over here and we'll agree with you. So that then started this whole, you know, the horse was out of the barn by then because we reached this agreement in record time and the barn was on fire. And that started such a conflagration of wetlands activity that I was just holding on and trying to keep up at that point. So that was kind of how I ended up spending probably a quarter of my time on wetlands issues.
Well, Luana, here we are 50 years after the passage of the Clean Water Act. And as we all painfully know, we are still talking about what are the waters of the United States. We thought you would have worked that all out with the Corps 30 years ago, but, you know, I guess maybe not. Why is this so hard to get established? And, you know, how do you see this sorting out in the near future?
Well, those are two questions. Why is it so hard? There's not one single answer, but it's an amalgamation of issues that are really interconnected. And we don't try to dissect it very often and say exactly what is it that's the problem. And the problem starts with Congress saying that you had to have a permit for a discharge into a navigable water and defining a navigable water as a water of the US. So that doesn't tell us very much, right? And in addition, all of a sudden, the public, as I say, Uncle Dan, who had the 40 acres and the bottom lands in the hills and hollers of Kentucky, is now a regulated entity. Most other federal environmental laws and regulations regulate corporations or entities of some kind, and people who have both the obligation and the technical expertise to study and know and understand how to comply with the laws. Now, all of a sudden, we are regulating, I think more than any other federal environmental law, individuals' homeowners, landowners who don't have the technical expertise and don't necessarily have the understanding. So then, you define what is a wetland in our regulations. Wetlands are areas that are inundated by saturated by surface or groundwater at a frequency and duration sufficient to support a prevalence of vegetation typically adapted for life in saturated soil conditions. Well, that's really clear, right? And so I memorized that when I was testifying before Congress, because I knew they'd say, what is a wetland? And I wanted to be able to tell them that that's what it was. But that doesn't really tell us very much. So that really doesn't help us a lot either. So if we layer on top of those issues, the fact that what is regulated is not just science. It's not just a question of what is a wetland, because Congress can only pass laws that are authorized by the US Constitution. And the Constitution authorized Congress to pass laws related to the regulation of interstate commerce. So almost all of our environmental laws and regulations flow from some connection to interstate commerce.
Mhm.
So we've gone from larger wetlands, regulating larger wetlands that clearly would have an interstate commerce nexus, to smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller bits, so that it's really unclear what it's not a question of what's a water of the US or what is a wetland. We need to actually, I believe we need to cast the narrative in a way that is a little more honest, a little more forthcoming. And the question is, what is a regulated water under the laws of the country and the Constitution? So that I don't hear that coming into play very much. And finally, our regulatory programs are built on three things. Science is there and it's very important. The laws are there and they're very important, but policy is the third leg of that three-leg stool. And that's how we get to any single point or place in environmental laws and regulations. And each administration, barring the clarity, and the other two especially, each administration wants to put its own stamp on policy and places a lot of emphasis on that. And quite frankly, they all have to come together for this to work very effectively.
Luana, you alluded to how to make the working relationship with the Corps of Engineers perhaps a little more effective for those late afternoon meetings. But I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit. I'm sure you wound up working with other federal agencies, Interior, Fish and Wildlife, in particular, Forest Service, and then states and tribes as well. What was your experience as to kind of the key to creating a spirit of, we're all in this together in terms of wetland protection or of environmental protection? What approach did you use to try to make that as effective as possible?
I think it's really important first to have really good communication. We work very closely with Fish and Wildlife Service, NOAA, and the Department of the Interior to create the Coastal America program to try to protect wetlands and coastal wetlands in particular. And so that was a very successful program that may or may not still be going on. I think the relationship with the states and the tribes is a little bit different. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a little bit different because the federal government hasn't even figured out what is or is not supposed to be regulated. And having been a state cabinet secretary, it's really hard to get your state to adopt something that has so much uncertainty in it. So I think the way to get states, there's provisions in the Clean Water Act to delegate the authority to issue and run the 404 permit program. And a couple of states have done that, but only a couple. And I tried to get it done in my state, but it's just such a hot potato affecting so many landowners. That plus the added uncertainty that's involved mean that I'm not optimistic that lots of states want it because it's just so brutal. I still have scars on my back from trying to protect the 404 program, but it was the right thing to do. And we tried to do that and move us toward no net loss.
Well, very good, Luana. Thank you for all of those perspectives. We do have a few minutes before the break to see if any of the panel members would like to ask a question of the other panel members. No trick questions, just good, straightforward, simple, short questions, or comment on anything that the other panelists might have had to say. And if you're ready to step in with something, be sure to unmute yourself and fire away. There has to be at least one question from a panelist to the other folks.
Just a
Ben,
quick-
you always come in, and then Jim after Ben,
okay.
and then
Oh.
Dan.
Dang, does Jim have to follow me, really?
Yes, he
No,
does.
Correct.
Yes, he
Dang.
does.
I would say, I drifted into the one water, integrated water management world because I recognized that Clean Water Act was never going to fully regulate groundwater or non-point source until there are major changes politically and congressionally. And so I think one of the questions is how can the supremely talented EPA staff and political leadership these days embrace a holistic approach without violating the current law? In other words, how do you adapt to the greater needs, not just groundwater and non-point, but temperature and climate change? How do you work with the existing law to make sure it's successful for the next 50 years? Jim, I ask you,
Yeah,
blank.
Jim.
how are you going to do it?
My only data point was, we look back and say the 72 Act was a resounding success, but it's interesting that it was passed, the override of the veto, the vote in the Senate was 52-12 with 36 abstentions.
Huh.
And in the House, it was 247-23 with 160 abstentions.
Oh,
So much for overwhelming support and the foundation we're all standing on.
if Dale, you had a point, I think, as well, you wanted to make or ask a question.
Question for Luana and Ben. What's your prognostication on how the Supreme Court's going to rule on the latest water case?
Oh, they're going to make it as clear as mud. I don't know. I can't prognosticate on it. I just know that the guidance that John Paul Woodley and I wrote in 2008 is eventually going to come to an end because the Supremes are going to change definitely the significant nexus test, and whether it goes to the more extreme approach of a Scalia test, I don't know. I hope not, but I don't know. I think it's wise for EPA to wait to see what the Supremes say before they try to finalize their quote unquote durable definition of waters of the US.
Luana, what is your crystal ball telling you?
What Ben said.
Okay.
He said it well, so I can't really add to that. And plus, every time I try to predict what the court's going to do, I'm wrong. So anyway, but I think it's tough. But I mean, I'd be interested in what the other panelists think also.
Ken, any thoughts on that?
Again, the Sackett case, looking into from a tribal perspective, we see in the Great Lakes, the protection of Monoman rice. I agree with Ben. Unfortunately, I think there is going to be a lessening of the Kennedy significant nexus test, and it will have a detriment in Indian country.
Ben, if I might exercise a moderator prerogative and respond to looking up into the future with, how are we going to make sure we can meet the challenges of the future? One thing I'm spending a lot of time on myself is mentoring young people and telling them what a tremendous opportunity it is to work for an agency like EPA. And we are the agency we have been because of the people who came to EPA and, dedicated their lives to this work. So I think a continued flow of good people is going to be absolutely essential. I think it was you who talked about how we're going to have to be much more innovative in the future, because the problems are much more complicated than, end of pipe treatment with groundwater issues, drinking water issues, non-point sources. It's going to just take more and more creativity. Well, we have come to the end of our allotted time. And again, I want to thank our panelists for all of the perspectives that they brought and the insights. We're going to take a 5-minute health break. And in addition to that, we've got a very special water-oriented video with some pretty exciting musical accompaniment. And I want to give special acknowledgement to Tony Garvin, who is responsible for pulling the video together. So we'll do that right now. And then when we come back, Alexis Strauss from Region 9 will be moderating our second panel. So Chuck, John, whoever is in control of there we go. Here's the 5-minute intermission. And please, only 5 minutes.
Steve. Water music. Welcome back, everybody. Lovely to be with you and to celebrate over 100 of us devoted to EPA getting together to celebrate the anniversary of the Clean Water Act. We have 3 terrific panelists. We have people who have worked in such different capacities, bringing their own perspectives. I'm going to start with a question for each of our panelists and go back around and then wrap up with questions for all of our panelists together. So let me first turn to Christy Bullitt. Christy has built a remarkable career in representing facilities and companies who are regulated by the Clean Water Act. Following Christy, we're going to turn to Jeff Ager and then Nancy Stoner. So Christy, in your career representing regulated entities, what has changed in terms of how companies interact with federal and state compliance inspectors, enforcement staff, and legal counsel? Don't forget to unmute.
I think
we
on the plus side, I think that, I mean, I tended before my retirement to represent fairly large regulated entities of all kinds. And, you know, I came to this practice in '82. The Clean Water Act was fairly well established and running, but as I think Luana said earlier, there was still a lot of uncertainty about how seriously to take certain things. That was my observation. Although I must say the industries that I represented took them very seriously. Now I think all of the regulated community takes these issues very, very seriously. That said, perhaps on the negative side, I do think a lot of those interactions have become more political, more adversarial, and less predictable. And I don't think that, and I recognize that that's true no matter who's in office. And I'm not sure that's a good thing for either the agency or the regulated community. Personally, I think it would be better if we could foster more trust and dialogue, not less. But that's, again, I'm speaking here not for any industry or client, but just my own personal observation over 40 years.
And maybe we will come back in a little bit to how we might make that happen. I'd like to turn to Jeff Ager. Jeff has experience in so many different ways. You've been the president of the Ohio River Sanitation Commission. You've been the executive director of the Water Environment Federation. You've had experience in Kentucky in stormwater and wastewater, also as executive director of the North Kentucky Sanitation District. Jeff, in turning to you, I wanted to focus on smaller rural and sometimes tribal communities across the country. Small wastewater, stormwater, and drinking water systems face such unique challenges in what EPA has called technical, managerial, and financial capability. What do you recommend be done to ensure communities are well served for years to come, especially rural communities?
Well, thanks, Alexis. And then let me first off say I am honored to be on this panel with such amazing leaders in the water industry. You know, I think for so long I've been involved 30 plus years, and it appears to me that on the utility director side, small community side, they've been trying to operate with one hand tied behind their back. And now it's like one arm and one leg tied behind their back, and we'll kind of get to that with workforce issues. But funding is such a critical need. And yet I think, with all due respect, there may be some local communities that really don't have the expertise to try to how to prioritize where that money should go to get the best bang for the buck. So I think organizations like NACWA and EPA and all of their leaders have been such a great partner with Rockwell that I think continuing to strengthen that, provide guidance, and help and make themselves available. I was blessed to be around at the time with Nancy and Chamanlin, and Lawana was my state director, and Ben was my national director. So, people who really got it and were willing to think outside the box and to really try those things. But more needs to be done. And I think it's really going to be leadership at all levels, kind of joining forces to try to help those people out, recognizing that they've got, such challenges ahead of them, but they really need some strong guidance and support to get where they need to go.
We'll come back to that because I'm interested in whether you think at the state and local level, the staffing that's in place to receive infrastructure funds, for instance, has an ability to move more money and more projects, because I haven't seen quite any big uptick in that capacity. Let's come back to that. I'd love to turn now to Nancy Stoner. Nancy has experience, as everybody knows, working in the Justice Department, in NRDC, in the Office of Water, and is here today as the Executive Director of the Potomac Riverkeeper Network. Welcome, Nancy. You've played so many roles inside and outside these organizations. What have you learned about partnerships and meaningful community engagement, and how can we all improve in this vital area?
Thank you, Alexis. And let me just say what a pleasure it is to be here with so many former friends and colleagues of mine from many different places that I've been over the years. I have always admired the staff at EPA and their great knowledge and dedication to the work that they do. And that's directly related to what Alexis just asked about, which is, I think, trying to figure out where the common ground is, even when there's lots of ground that isn't common, and figuring out how we can work together on that common ground and make progress, and not make assumptions about people because of whom they represent, or the agency they're at, or the office they're in, and assume that they love clean water, because every single person I ever have met loves clean water and prefers it to polluted water. And so the question is how you find the ways that you can work together. I do want to say on this question of the scope of the Clean Water Act, maybe Lawana's idea of serving bourbon to everyone would have brought people together. It is, I think, unfortunate that the issue is back to the Supreme Court and that we haven't been able to work it out yet, that we haven't found that common ground. And there's just one thing I want to say about it, because none of the earlier speakers did, which is part of our problem is because of the way water works in nature. You actually have to protect the upstream waters in order to protect the downstream ones. And so in order to achieve the goals of the Clean Water Act, protecting the biological, chemical, and physical integrity of the waters, you have to protect those interconnected waters. And so figuring out how to do that in a way where you have buy-in of all the people who are affected, that is the challenge. And that has been a challenge for many years.
I have a feeling we should come back to this because I think we would all like to talk a bit more about it. Let me return to Christy. In your work representing companies, what do you think are the measures that state and federal agencies could take to improve their interactions with regulated facilities in the interest of high compliance rates?
Well, I think, most companies talk to their regulators when they have a permit that is being processed. Sometimes that's straightforward, sometimes it's contentious. And then occasionally they'll see somebody else for a compliance audit of some kind. And that's it. I think a lot of companies are afraid to reach out to their regulators lest they get an answer that they didn't anticipate, and that will, God forbid, suggest that they're not in compliance or not covered in some fashion. It's just, again, because I think the relationship has become more adversarial, there's just not enough communication. And that's partly the fault of the statute, because the statute's it's a pretty blunt object. You're either in compliance or you're not, and the penalties are pretty high. They're very high, and they get higher every time they're adjusted for inflation. I think if there were more trust, less adversarialness, more of an ability to work these issues out so that everybody understands what's expected, you would see more of an effort being, I think you would see higher compliance rates. I also think, and this is completely a personal opinion, that it's been my experience that smaller operators have more trouble. And it's just, bigger operators have, whatever they're doing, have more resources, they have more boots on the ground. They have a much greater access to understanding and training, and they use it, and they have reputational and other interests that cause them to really, really, really want to be in compliance. I think smaller operators do not have those things. They're more marginal, and they need more help. They need more attention, but not in a draconian, punitive way. Just more assistance, more encouragement, and more outreach.
So indeed. Jeff, I have a workforce question, and it's something that you've been concerned with in your career. How do we encourage and cultivate a workforce to operate, manage, and lead our local, regional water and wastewater utilities?
Well, let me put that on hold for 1 second, give you a quick answer back to what do we do with those small communities. I would love to see EPA work with the states and the engineering associations, both state and local, to create an inside the states Engineers Without Borders. and with that funding, on how, these small communities that really can't figure that out, provide them the resources, not just the money. Provide them the resources to be able to make smart decisions and wise decisions, and have somebody that they can rely on, that they're maybe not worried about the politics of hiring this engineering firm or that engineering firm. So I think that's a really crazy out of the box, but it could work. And I think if all of the entities came together and said, well, this is a serious problem in tribal and rural America that we have to address, because it's just going to get worse. This workforce issue is critical, is getting worse. I talked to so many utility directors who just can't keep, in particular, engineers. In most cases, in most states, and most communities, funding is capped. The pension systems have been just torn apart. And so it takes more than just that, want to be a good public servant to be able to operate, and stay in that industry, especially with everything else that's going on, that it's really an incredibly critical issue. Wastewater operators, again, I think there are a lot of entities that are trying to do things out there. NACWA has teamed with CORE that I'm actually doing some part-time work for, doing leadership training in utilities. And it is amazing how many utilities are taking advantage of that. So really trying to encourage that, support that. The culture is important. And again, it just may be that we've got to find creative ways to supplement some of that workforce to bring them in. It probably is the most critical issue that's keeping most utility directors awake right now, is the workforce issue.
I'm hopeful also that we might be able to show young people a path up into those kind of working responsibilities, which may not be obvious to them, because how many people really see the operations of a drinking water or wastewater system in their day-to-day life. Nancy. The
Well,
last
30
of our
seconds,
individual-
that's my next crazy idea. My next crazy idea is when I was at the Water Environment Federation, we were this close to getting the Ad Council to develop one of their iconic 4 or 5 year campaigns on the value of water. We have got to promote water to the average Joe and Jane out there so they understand how important it is. And along with that, it may incentivize folks to want to be in that career. But my gosh, we need a national marketing campaign for the value of water.
We do. Nancy, the last of our individual questions before we go to our all panel questions. What opportunities are you seeing for the enhanced use and enjoyment of the Potomac River as a result of the progress that has been realized under the Clean Water Act?
Yeah, so thank you, Alexis. So I'm going to actually try to show a few photos here. So we'll see if that works. Do you folks see that? Arlington Beach, do you see it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Just want to make sure. So, most of the discussion today has been started with the 1972 Clean Water Act and how the waters were dirty at the time, were burning, were filled with sewage and algae and so forth, as President Johnson said about the Potomac at the time. But of course, before that, they were cleaner, right? So if we went back to indigenous times, we would certainly find beautiful, clean rivers filled, teeming with life and so forth. But even as recently as the 1920s, we had beaches on the Potomac River. This is Arlington Beach, which is, you can see the Washington Monument in the background. And the tidal basin is another one where we had people, there were up to 20,000 people a day swimming in the tidal basin. In the 1920s, and bathhouses and so forth. So our vision, and that's part of the reason I wanted to show pictures, is that our vision at the Potomac Riverkeeper Network is to have public beaches on the Potomac River that are monitored daily, that are safe for swimming. And so you don't have to drive to Ocean City from DC. You can go right out to the Potomac and go swimming like these ladies are right here at Arlington Beach. Trying to get to the next one here. No. Let's try that. Does that show it to you? No.
Not yet, but maybe Patricia can advance the slides for us.
I wonder why they're not advancing. Golly, I gotta get to dirty and clean here.
Try your right arrow key, Nancy.
Yeah, I did that. Oh, did that work?
Mm.
No. No, I don't know why that is. Of course it worked before the program. All right, well, I'm not going to be able to show you what I want to show you then. Maybe I'll try to get it to come back later. But the idea here is that that we have these these beaches. I'm not saying they're completely clean, but clean enough to swim. And then we polluted them, right? And so the Potomac was, yeah, can you get to Georgetown Gap there? No, still no Georgetown Gap.
Just click on the picture.
Yeah,
There
there you go.
Can you see that now?
Yeah, keep going, Nance.
Okay, sorry, very sorry. All right, so this is a picture that is very well known to many people. It's actually 1973. And this is a place where you still have combined sewer overflows today into Georgetown. And the water is often contaminated with raw sewage, but it doesn't look totally disgusting, brown, muddy like it does in this photo. And so this was just around the time of the passage of the Clean Water Act. And we began all those programs that Jim Hanlon and others talked about to invest in our sewage treatment plants. The next slide. And part of what led to this were those investments, those permitting programs that we talked about, the water quality standards programs, but also activism. So these are the river fests from the 1980s. People began, we had Earth Day, obviously, we had people getting engaged and demanding clean water. And what we do at the Potomac Riverkeeper Network is protect the public's right to clean water. And we do that by stopping pollution and enhancing access. And in the last slide is a combination of, this is a real photo again, this is a platform that was in the tidal basin that people used to dive off of and into the water, and it's combined with a modern picture of the tidal basin. And I don't know that there will be swimming there, but we have a community science water quality monitoring program that shows that public health-based standards for swimming are met more than 75% of the time now at the 21 sites that we survey. So if we finish addressing the combined sewer overflows, which DC Water and Alex Renew are working hard to do, we believe that we can have safe swimming, and this vision is within our reach. So, so that's what I wanted to say about the opportunities that we see already here in the nation's capital that can be a model for the nation.
Thanks, Nancy. It's fishable and swimmable ever yet. For all three of our panelists, I'd like to ask if you could amend any portion of the Clean Water Act, what would you change? Christy?
Well, I would change two things. I would modify 309 to develop a more effective non-point source control program. And I use the word control intentionally, because I don't think the NPDES program per se should be a model for that. But there are, and I don't think it has to be, but I think that there are regulatory type concepts that would be very helpful, as opposed to just give the states money and hope they do it. I think, everyone understands that and there are all kinds of different Clean Water Act programs and issues that we're still grappling with, but certainly for some of our most important goals, non-point sources are the remaining largely unregulated cause. And I think the impediment to developing a more rigorous program is that we think that it has to look like the NPDES program. We don't think that's true. But the other thing I would do, because we live, whether we like it or not, in a world of scarce resources, is modify the effluent guidelines program to change the deadlines. Don't have to change anything else, but make the deadlines for reconsidering what is BAT longer, because as a practical matter, whether we like it or not, it takes a long time to roll out an effluent guidelines program. And once you've made the investment, that investment needs to be used and useful for a reasonable period of time. Otherwise, I think the expectation obviously was that if we impose these requirements, companies would innovate. They would do all the innovation, do all the research, and come up with the least expensive way to comply. But we don't wave a magic wand and necessarily produce that. And if you want to actually allow time for that innovation, I think you need a longer time frame within which the effluent guideline applies, right? However rigorous it is. And the agency needs to be in a position where it can thoughtfully conduct the rulemakings that it needs to conduct to establish those effluent guidelines. That's my view.
Thank you. Very thoughtful. Jeff, what would you change about the Clean Water Act? Mute. You're on mute.
I don't think there's necessarily anything that I would change. I was very pleased to see the integrated planning codified into the Clean Water Act. I'd like to see more done with that. I'd like to see that broaden. I think too often we kind of get siloed in our approaches to to address and deal with the Clean Water Act regulations and items, but every community is different. Every community has its own prioritization. There needs to be an acceptance of that and a realization to that, and allow communities to really, again, make the investment where it's going to have that immediate bang for the buck. So I would love to see the integrated planning broadened and really applied locally to help communities identify the best priorities to address these issues.
Nancy, what would you change?
So in our watershed, it's very clearly the non-point source provisions of the Clean Water Act that are failing us. And of course, that's the case in many, many watersheds across the country, where about 80% of the pollution, I believe, is now from non-point sources. In the Shenandoah, which we protect as well as the Potomac, we have almost 200 million birds raised every year in concentrated animal feeding operations. That, of course, that term is in the 1972 Clean Water Act. Yet the number of permits that we have for those facilities in the Shenandoah is 0. And so there are too many loopholes. There are too many ways in which those facilities are not being regulated. And then you also have less relevant in my watershed, but you also have row cropping. So we have, in the pollution associated with that, non-point source runoff associated with that, we have decades of experience now in best management practices for agriculture, whether it's for feedlot operations or row crop operations. We have very sophisticated tools now, GIS tools, all kinds of tools to help figure out what's the best type of management practice to put where. So we need better programs, programs that link performance to dollars. That's what we need, I think. That's what should be in the Clean Water Act in order to really make progress moving ahead.
Next question for our panel. What are the most important investments, whether infrastructure or otherwise, that we should be making now for the benefit of those 10 years hence? Christy?
Well, again, I think that pivoting on what Nancy said and what Jeff said earlier, there is a lot of information out there. We're not necessarily getting it through the right professionals in the right way to the right people. And I also think that, again, I think, you know, that we think that if we simply regulate enough, that will spur innovation from the private sector. And sometimes it does. But in a lot of cases, there isn't any one actor. You know, there's not a Bill Gates or an Elon Musk who's got the money to be able to invest in the range of technology research that is really needed to deal with some of these problems. I don't think we're going to deal with them by, you know, calling everything a point source and shoving it into the point source category. We need a more nuanced approach that looks at all the different kinds of activity on the land. Because, you know, I think Nancy said we need to, if we're going to protect downstream waters, we need to protect upstream waters. Well, the land is connected to those, whether you call it a water or not. There's also all kinds of activity, and it's not just companies. It's not just the regulated community. You know, we can demonize them all we want, but it's us as consumers. It's us as, you know, people who want what we want at a price we're willing to pay without being willing to give anything up. That we all make choices every day that cause pollution. And I think you're going to need more investment, probably at the federal level, in innovation and instruction, and more of a sense of buy-in by individuals that there is something they can do about it. whether it's saving water or making better choices as consumers to address the problem. I mean, when I was a kid, we used to vacation on the Black River in Missouri, where I'm from, every year. And without fail, I would get sick because the Black River, while it was a beautiful water body, was very polluted. And so I would either get an ear infection or a sinus infection or something like that. Nobody wants that, but there's a price to be paid to make sure that all those waters that we love and use and their upstream waters are protected. And distributively, I think that requires buy-in from our citizenry as a whole, not just the few that we've assigned responsibility to.
Thank you. Jeff, what would you say?
Well, yeah, I'm really concerned that a ticking time bomb might be our existing assets and infrastructure, especially among the policy or the money folks that have to approve the budgets for local communities to run it till it fails. And that's just not a good alternative. And I think sometimes we get so focused on other issues that we're losing sight of our dams, our pipes, our pump stations, our treatment plants, and the condition and shape that those are in. That if we don't have a robust program to support those, to do the preventive maintenance, the risk analysis, it's a ticking time bomb that we have to make sure we keep the focus on that as we go forward.
The whole asset management program. Nancy, what would you add?
Well, in the Potomac River watershed, the investments over the next 10 years that will be the most important are actually those for the combined sewer overflows. Some communities have addressed those already. We are addressing them now. And those will be the ones that will really make the waters cleaner in 10 years than they are today. I did want to respond though to what Christy said, because I was wondering if she had heard what I said. What I was suggesting about agriculture was linking performance to dollars. I wasn't actually saying that they should necessarily be treated as point sources.
And I didn't think you were.
Okay, all right.
No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to attribute that to you at all. It was more of a commentary on the recent, kerfluffle over, groundwater, and it was not directed at you.
Yeah,
or anything you said.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Christy. I do think that the concentrated animal feeding operations, which again are within the definition of point source in the Clean Water Act, they should actually be required to have permits. And the amount of manure they produce is so significant as a pollution source in our waterways. But I think there's lots of different ways to do this, and it could be through a Clean Water Act program or through another program. But to me, the most important thing is that we get something for our dollar, that we get pollution reduction for the dollar. And I think we know how to do that, and that's what we should do.
Okay, next question. And I would like to invite Ken Norton to chime in on this if he wishes. It's with regard to the over 500 tribal governments that EPA works with, as do other important federal partners like the Indian Health Service. What are the most meaningful ways that the EPA regions and headquarters can work with tribal governments to improve environmental and public health conditions in Indian country? Who'd like to start? Ken, would you start for us?
Sure. And good to see you, Alexis. As you heard from many of the tribes in Region 9, it's the deficiency of funding under the environmental programs and the infrastructure programs. Tribes, when they started out in the mid 80s under these programs, were severely underfunded, and they continue to be underfunded. And so if we are to make headroads in Indian country, we really have to address the environmental injustice that occurs in Indian country under the minimal funds that are applied to tribes in implementing infrastructure and environmental programs.
I would agree. It was always so frustrating to have to divide the available funds under an ever increasing number of eligible recipients, meaning that everybody got less, something that Jim would help agonize over with us, as did Bob. Jeff, what would you say?
I mean, other than the obvious funding, I couldn't add any much more to that.
Christy?
I think a lot of it comes down to money and again, making that not only the money, but the other resources that are necessary to make sure that money is well spent, available to the right people at the right time.
One of my observations would be that when money might go to a smaller tribe with a very small staff, EPA's accountability requirements for reporting of both outcomes, monitoring, finance, et cetera, can sometimes use up almost half a person year or an FTE of a small tribe staff just to be in compliance with the grant making requirements. And so there are things about giving an organization multi-millions to build infrastructure, and they have the wherewithal to do that. And when it goes to a small recipient, which could be a tribal government, it becomes ever harder to come forward with the same level. We haven't scaled the reporting piece very much, given the accountability expectations. So it's difficult. Nancy, would you like to weigh in on this?
Well, I think this is a great, I want to echo what Radhika said. We have a great opportunity here because there is a lot of money that will be available for all kinds of infrastructure problems, the kinds that Jeff is talking about and so forth, and including communities that have never had water and sanitation, or never have had safe drinking water, and never had fish they could eat, and so forth. So we just have such a fantastic opportunity with this new legislation and the funding that will go along with it. I hope it's as successful as the construction grants program was in moving ahead protection of our waterways across the country.
Let's hope so. A couple of final questions before I will be turning it back to Bob. Earlier, panel one had talked about Clean Water Act jurisdiction and what the Supreme Court might do. What should EPA do? I want you to be surgically specific. What should EPA do if its Clean Water Act jurisdiction is newly curtailed by a higher court? Who's going to jump first? One of the suggestions. Go ahead, Christy.
I'll jump in and say, nothing the Supreme Court does is going to constrain in any way, shape, or form the ability of states to protect what they consider to be waters of the state. And so if there are waters that, fall off the table, it is entirely possible and appropriate for the agency to work with states to, again, spread the message about the importance of those waters to downstream waters within the state and outside the state. And because I think this notion that we have to do it because the states just won't, I'm not saying that that hasn't happened, but I think the states can be effective regulators and in this sphere, and what they decide will be respected and applied. So I think there are those opportunities there. I don't think it has to be, I don't think it has to mean degradation overall at all.
Is that something that EPA should do, or should the Corps be in that discussion as well?
Well, I think I up until the last definition of waters of the United States, but one, I hadn't really seen EPA and the Corps necessarily always agree on what was the water of the United States. You saw a greater harmony over that with the 2015-16 rule. And I think my impression is that the states, that EPA and the Corps are working very closely on the current rule. But I think in any long-term solution, any outreach has to be with both agencies hand in hand.
And then it will probably also have to be with those who border that water and with any sovereign governments within that boundary as well.
Yeah.
And
Right.
it just makes for some very complicated interactions. Jeff, do you want to add to this?
Well, I think it's that. I think really look for greater collaborative opportunities. And you know, we sometimes hate to promote the negative, but I think we have to sometimes talk about the consequences. And they're not good, right? So I don't think we should, as a you know, a group of water professionals, I don't think we should back away from what the consequences might be and highlight the successes where they are. But, you know, I mean, I go back to kind of the marketing thing. So I think a collaborative effort where we're really trying to educate and inform people on what these consequences are and see how we can work with more partners to do what we can in spite of that effort.
Thank you. And Nancy, I'm going to give you the last word before I turn it back to Bob.
Okay, well, I want to agree with both Christy and Jeff on that. Absolutely, the state should step in and make sure that they're doing their job also of protecting waterways for the people in the state, and local governments can do a lot as well. So, and matter of fact, they don't even need to wait for the Supreme Court in order to step in and protect waters, and lots of states and local governments do that already. And I definitely want to agree with what Jeff said. I mean, it's wetlands, I think, is a good example. Probably in 1972, we knew wetlands were important for flood control and reducing pollution loads and so forth. We probably weren't thinking a lot about climate change and how important they are for climate change. Right. And so now we know more, we know even more why we need to protect wetlands. So if the federal government isn't doing a good job, by all means, let's get the states in there, let's get the local governments in there, and let's look holistically. As Ben Grobles was saying earlier, let's look holistically, one water, let's protect it for all of the reasons that we benefit from it.
Thank you, Christy, Jeff, Nancy. Thank you for joining us as well, Ken, and to everyone who is part of this, listening to this second panel. We're most appreciative of your attention. Bob, back to you.
Hey, thanks, Alexis. Yeah, I'm really delighted with all of the insights and perspectives shared in the panel today by both panels and the excellent job that our moderators did. Clearly that we've accomplished a whole lot with the 72 Clean Water Act and its predecessors and its successors. And we still have a lot more to do. And I'm very pleased to see some innovative ideas floated, some openness to innovation, some recognition that we have much more to do. And as I look at people who have signed into the panel today, I see several former colleagues of mine from the Office of Water that I know are still very much engaged in their civilian life, if you will, in the effort to protect these important resources, working for small NGOs and watershed associations, working for state agencies. I think that water's in our blood, literally and figuratively, and I think it's terrific to see so much commitment to the goals of the 50-year-old law still burning bright among our EPA Alumni Association members and our colleagues from other areas that have been involved in the effort to protect water. We've got an opportunity now. In just a couple of minutes, we'll throw the switch, and those who are still participating in the call will have an opportunity to move into a small group. Pretty good chance you'll know somebody in that group. If you don't know others, you'll meet some interesting people, I'm sure, from when we've done this with other calls, the one we did with EPA's 50th anniversary 2 years ago. So I encourage you to stay if you can. There's no script for those. It's an opportunity to talk some about what we shared today with our panelists and our moderators, and the EPA AA for Water, but it's wide open. Spend as much time as you want talking to those who are thrown into your small group. We don't actually select the small groups. That happens by some Zoom magic. But I'm pretty confident that you'll find the conversation interesting. So once again, thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to those who participated. This video has been recorded, so it'll be available for you to share with others if you think it's worth doing that, or for you to go back and listen to again. We'll also be sending tonight or tomorrow to everyone a link to a 50th anniversary Clean Water Act video that was produced by folks at American University, and they're giving a 30-day free pass to members of the Alumni Association to watch the video. I previewed it earlier today. I thought it was quite good. I think you'll enjoy it. So with that, Chuck or John, you can throw the switch to open the breakout rooms. And once again, I encourage people to stick around to participate in one of those. Thanks very much.